In my line of work, presenting the highest quality image is key. Start building your website today at squarespace.com. Use the offer code CARL to get a 10% discount. I'm Carl Taylor, and this is my Squarespace.
One common question we keep getting is about exposure and determining whether or not you've captured the right exposure. Now, it's an interesting question because inside your camera you have a built-in light meter, and inside that light meter you can read whether you've roughly got the right exposure or the image overexposed or underexposed. But you never really know whether or not that is accurate. Now, the best way to know whether your exposure has been captured perfectly is to look at the information on the histogram. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with a histogram, I'm just going to show you one here. Here's a shot that I've taken of the studio just here that you can see on the back of that camera. And if I put up the histogram information, that graph, that representation, tells me about the exposure value of the captured image. Now, if that's a little bit complicated, let me try and explain it a little bit easier. Let's have a look on this whiteboard here. Basically, a histogram is simply a graph explaining exposure. So if you imagine that this is the graph, and this end represents the brightest highlight points, so I'm going to put highlights there, and this end of the graph represents the deepest shadows, the blacks. So this is the blacks and this is the white values in the image, and the graph will represent where the data is captured and what part of it is in the midtones, what part of it is in the shadows or in the blacks, and what part of it is in the highlights. So if you have a graph that looks like this, you can see that overall the exposure seems to have been captured pretty well. If you have a graph like this, where it's all up this end, we can see that there's very little shadow detail in the image and a lot of highlight detail. So let's look at that in practice on an image on screen. If I bring up this image here in Photoshop, we can see that this is a photograph which is predominantly light and bright. And we've basically got an image of a white teacup on a white background. And if you look at the histogram information, you can see that the highlight end is very high, peaked up on the graph. And here, going down, there's very little detail and no detail at all, running from the mid-tones down into the shadows. So as a high-key bright image, the histogram's showing that that's in the highlight end. Let's look at this one on the dark cup on a dark background, and we can see a completely different story. Here we can see there's very little highlight image, very little data in the highlights, more data captured in the shadows and the midtones. Now, those two examples are at the extreme of each end of exposure. They're unusual in that we've got a black object on a black background, or we had a white object on a white background. More generally speaking, when we're taking photographs, we're capturing tones from the shadows through to the highlights with a lot of mid-tones in between. So look at your scene and imagine what sort of histogram you would expect to see. And then bring up your histogram on your camera. You can do that just by pressing the info button, and then you can see the data captured in the histogram. And here we can see we've got a good range of pixel data captured in shadows all the way through to highlights. And if we look at the actual image, we can also see that it has a good range of highlights, shadows and midtones. So that's pretty much it on histograms. Have a look at your camera manual, have a look at your manuals in Photoshop to learn a little bit more.
My passion is photography. Whether shooting for clients or teaching students, the excitement of great photography never gets old. Check out my website for free training, a complete range of courses and even photography workshops. Thank you for watching.